Okay, so hello everyone. Today I will be discussing a figure who I think is very important in ancient Greek mythology slash religion, namely Protogonus-Phanes. Now that is a modern hyphenation. That's not really how he was known in antiquity. He was typically called by one of those names in antiquity. I would venture to say that Protogonus is probably the older um, theonym, that is God name here. But I, contrary to many, would say that both names were known in deep antiquity and that this deity is actually much older than is so often presumed. So, uh, to introduce this figure, who we'll be talking about extensively uh, probably a series of talks, I imagine, we're going to be looking at a character who is essentially, as I would describe him, the creator god of the pre-Christian ancient Greeks. So even though there are some kind of henotheistic conceptions of Zeus, that is to say, some theologies from antiquity like Stoicism that seem to identify Zeus with a kind of all encompassing godhead, I would venture to say that that idea in Stoicism and other such strains of thought ultimately stems from the Orphico-Dionysian religion, which inspired this henotheistic conception. Right? By henotheism, I mean one godhead who includes the many divinities. We could also call it a monistic theology. But at any rate, the idea that there was an intelligent creator god, I think, is a distinctively Orphic slash Orphico-Dionysian conception. And I think that this deity, namely Protogonus-Phanes, rather than being a creation of the Hellenistic period or even a late antiquity, as many would have it, I think that actually this god can be, in some shape or form, dated back to the classical period and even beyond, notionally, into the archaic period and linked to other Indo-European cognates. There is a famous conception in the Vedic texts, particularly the 10th book of the Rig Veda. There's a famous conception of the Mahapurusha, the cosmic man, identified with Prajapati, a created divinity. This idea of a humanoid creator god whose body parts correlate with constituent components of the universe. And his name, Prajapati, Praja in Sanskrit means like progeny. It's a direct cognate of our Latinate word progeny. And the Pati means like Lord. So he's like the Lord of all creatures. And literally, though, progeny or praja, it means fourth or first and born, so to speak, etymologically. And Protogonus's name is exactly that, the firstborn. And as we're going to see, I would say he's to be identified not only as a created divinity, but created divinity who creates out of his own self, because his body is the totality of the universe, much like the Indic Prajapati or Mahapurusha. So I would say he's the Greek equivalent. And I'd say much like that figure who we know from Vedic texts was around in the most ancient of times, I would venture to say that despite the wealth of evidence for Protogonus-Phanes coming from the Hellenistic and period and from late antiquity even, I would venture to say that there are hints that a rather robust conception of him as a creator god and as a kind of pantheistic entity in whom all beings exist is a conception that can be found already in the classical period, which is a radical claim. But I think it's worth exploring because very often we encounter in world mythology the figure of a creator divinity. He's a staple character, really, of world religion. And yet, in Greek antiquity, before, let's say, late antiquity, it can be kind of difficult to find such a figure, a creator god among the Greeks. And I don't accept that they didn't have such a character in their religion. The Timaeus, a text that I've done extensive study of on this channel, you can go look at. Perhaps it's best to watch some of that video before turning to this one. But at any rate, in that text, the Timaeus of Plato, we get a narrative of creation, and we get a figure called the demiurge, the creator god. And here today, in my treatment of Protogonus-Phanes, I will argue that this figure, Protogonus-Phanes, was the created divinity known in Plato's time who inspired the otherwise unnamed demiurge or artisanal creator god of Plato's creation story in the Timaeus. Now, the image that I've produced here is a rather famous marble image from Italy called the Modena relief, and it depicts a figure who's sometimes called Mithras by some people, but I think that's kind of erroneous. I mean, it could be Mithras, but Mithras in a syncretistic context identified with Protogonus-Phanes. So I think this being whom we see here is Protogonus-Phanes. You can see atop his head there is an eggshell with a snake on it, and the snake coils around his torso. On his torso you can see several animal heads sticking out, namely a ram, a goat, and a lion. All of these creatures are zodiacal creatures, right? Leo, Aries, Capricorn. Okay, and so you can't see it in these depictions, but around there is also a rim, an egg-shaped rim that is the zodiac belt with all the zodiac constellations. So the point being is he is the creator god who emerged from the cosmic egg that was the monad at the beginning of creation. He emerged from that when a snake divinity, Kronos, in the sense of time, wrapped around the egg and cracked it open. And he, this all-encompassing created divinity, arose and arranged the world. That is who Protogonus-Phanes is. But rather than just speak about him in the abstract, we're going to construct this deity from the primary sources. And in doing so, I'm going to advocate for this unusual position that this divinity, rather than being a Hellenistic conception or a late antique syncretistic product, I'm instead going to argue that he is a native Greek divinity who is known from the most remote of times, but simply due to an accident of history, if you will, the evidence, the textual evidence describing this divinity has not come down to us in a particularly clear way, which has resulted in him being overlooked, and his antiquity, i.e. the fact that he was around in the most early times in the culture, has been overlooked because of the nature of the evidence. But hopefully by the end of this video or series of videos, you will be endowed with an understanding of how it is that this divinity was conceived and how he was actually around culturally in quite an early period, even though many would disagree in modern scholarship. Okay, so there's the whole relief that I was describing. You can see it much better now with the zodiac rim all about. You can see the four heads symbolizing the four winds of the cardinal directions blowing on this all-containing cosmic egg, with the zodiac kind of symbolizing the rim of heaven, which was conceived by the ancients as being the outer rim of the universe that contained everything else. You could call the universe Uranos, heaven, because Uranos, heaven, was this outer rim of this spherical or egg-shaped all that is our universe. And it is from that egg that Protogonus-Phanes arose. There he is with hoofs on his feet, with a snake, Kronos, time, coiled about him, with departed eggshells, with flame and light exuding, because his name Phanes is related to the verb phaino, to show or to shine. He's the shining one, the one who first appeared. And as I said, he has these animal heads sprouting out of his torso because he embodies within himself all the forms of animalian life delineated in the zodiac. And if you recall from my Timaeus video, if you've seen it, you can go and see it if you are so inclined. There, the creator god is conceived of, the demiurge, as looking to a paradigm that is a blueprint, and that paradigm is conceived of as the all-containing animal that is noetic. And the demiurge, the artisan, the creator god, looks to that paradigm, that all-containing animal, and creates, modeled on that all-containing animal that is invisible, he creates a visible all-containing animal that models that invisible all-containing animal. And so I submit in this talk that this conception of a creator god creating an all-containing animal based on another all-containing animal comes from the idea that in Orphic mythology, as attested in the Derveni Papyrus, the oldest surviving European book, incidentally, a very ancient text, in there we get an account of Zeus becoming pregnant with the universe after he ingests a being who is identified with the totality of the universe. And I think, as we'll see from the text directly, the beings described there, pregnant, all-encompassing Zeus, and the being whom he swallows, what we see there is Zeus consuming Protogonus-Phanes. And that dynamic of Zeus as creator god ingesting another divine, all-encompassing entity is simply, Plato is simply reworking an established Orphic cosmogony or account of creation, wherein Protogonus-Phanes is an all-containing creator divinity who is consumed by Zeus, who becomes pregnant with the universe after consuming the one who is the universe, and births the universe anew. And as a result of that infusing pregnancy, these two conceptions of the Godhead are one and the same, right? They are assimilated. But we'll dive into the specific sources from which I'm constructing this creation story. It's worth pointing out, though, we're speaking of Orphic cosmology. So what is meant by Orphic cosmology? Well, cosmological accounts that are ascribed to Orpheus, that were composed by Orpheus, the mythic bard. But what's a bit difficult is that there are many cosmogonies ascribed to Orpheus, and they don't necessarily neatly correlate with each other. So what do I mean by that? So we have the Derveni Papyrus that we're going to be turning to that has an account of, I submit, Protogonus being swallowed by Zeus, and Zeus becomes pregnant with the universe. We have, though, a different Orphic cosmogony ascribed to Eudemus the Peripatetic, and in that cosmology we don't really get a mention of, in that cosmogonic account I should say, we don't really get a mention of Protogonus-Phanes per se. Instead, the cosmology seems to begin with Nux or Nyx, that is Lady Night, okay? Then we get an Orphic cosmogony that's ascribed to a certain Hieronymus or Hellenicus, who are kind of stoicizing Hellenistic cosmogonic poets. And in their account, you get mention of a cosmic egg and Chronos, time, the snake constricting that egg. And because it's a stoicizing cosmology, it's very materially oriented with talk of the elements, mud as the kind of arche or first principle. Then we get Aristophanes' birds, wherein there's a parody of Orphic cosmogony that involves Lady Night, Nux, the first principle mentioned by Eudemus in his preserved Orphic cosmogony. There in Aristophanes' birds, the play, you also get night, and you also get a cosmic egg. So again, even though Aristophanes doesn't expressly identify Orpheus, he seems to be imitating him. So Aristophanes is obviously classical period. So even though the eggs cosmogony described in Hieronymus is a Hellenistic text, there seems to have already been a cosmogonic egg tradition known to Aristophanes. Also, Epimenides has an ex ovo cosmogony, or a creation story involving the universe arising from an egg, which I submit is an early Orphic trope that has parallels in early Vedic tradition, where they too have a golden egg as the source of the cosmos. That Hiranyagarbha, Garbha in Sanskrit, also means womb as well as egg. Then there's another Orphic cosmogony known as, it's typically denominated in modern scholarship as the rhapsodic theogony. And that one is normally dismissed as either a Hellenistic or even late antique concoction. But as we're going to see from today's adventure, in actuality, even though there are some late elements to that recension of Orpheus's cosmogony, it correlates very closely with the Derveni Papyrus, which is very ancient. And so we have reason to presume that even though the rhapsodic theogony is primarily preserved in late Neoplatonism, late antiquity, nonetheless, there is good reason to presume that most, if not all, of its content was known in the classical world, because the Derveni Papyrus, as we're going to see, I think, strongly resembles what we find in this rhapsodic theogony. Then there's also the 6th century figure, Pherecydes of Syros, who I argue also has a similar cosmology, as well as the rather famous pre-Socratic philosopher and biologist and prophet Empedocles, who I think can also be identified as strongly influenced by an established monistic Orphic mythic cosmogony. So that's just an overview of the different strains of Orphic theogony or theogonic poetry, I should say. And I'm going to show that despite apparent differences, they can all be conceived of as actually being one authentic Orphic tradition. And it was the inherent monism at play in that tradition that enabled for this degree of apparent variation. Now, what I mean by that is not abundantly clear at this point, but it will become clearer as we progress. Okay, so again, just briefly, here are some diagrammatic sort of representations of the various Orphic cosmogonic accounts. So you can see, starting with the most detailed one in some ways, the rhapsodic theogony preserved in the Neoplatonic philosophers. There you begin with the deity time, Chronos, as well as ether. I should mention that the egg out of which Protogonus-Phanes arises as the first all-encompassing being is identified in the Orphic tradition with this quintessential element ether, quintessential meaning the fifth element, but importantly, the one from which all other elements derive their essence, because it's the ultimate source, that it's the substance of the egg from which the cosmos arose. So you begin with time, Chronos, and this ethereal egg, this egg of ether, as well as chaos, the void in which that egg is positioned. And out of this arises Protogonus-Phanes, who couples with Nyx or Nux, night, who I suggest and will prove from text is to be conceived of as the female half of the inherently androgynous or hermaphroditic Protogonus-Phanes. So Protogonus-Phanes, Nyx, one hermaphroditic being who split and sort of constitute a male-female pair, much like the rabbinical tradition about Adam and Eve being originally a hermaphrodite who was split in half. Okay, and then after that you get the Titans, and then Zeus, and then Dionysus. And in the Orphic hymns, the late antiquity Orphic hymns, Dionysus is kind of identified with Protogonus-Phanes, and I think there's a soundness to that, because if Protogonus-Phanes is the original all-containing divinity, it makes sense that that there could be a later avatar of his that could also be identified with the plenitude of the cosmos. But we'll get to that later. There's also a different stemma, if you will, or genealogical arrangement found in Alexander of Aphrodisias, wherein you start with Chaos, Oceanus, Night, Uranus or Uranus, and then Zeus. But in the same source, there's a different arrangement of rulers, a certain Aristophanes, who is actually one and the same as Protogonus-Phanes, it's just an alternative name, then Nyx, and then Uranus. So something to keep track of as we go through these different genealogies of cosmogony ascribed to Orpheus that seem to contradict each other is this concept of the order of not just in which the order in which divinities arise, but also the order in which they rule. That is something to track, and it can become apparent as we look at these different schemata how it would seem as if they're different and incapable of being reconciled, but over time we'll build up the case that they can all be married together in one coherent worldview. Of course, I would subscribe to the view that many different cosmogonic poems were ascribed to Orpheus. It was a very broad tradition with many different tales, and each of them may have contained slightly different details, but they were still intended to be conceived of as one unified monistic cosmology. And sadly, modern scholarship, in the obsession to try and taxonomize the differences between these cosmogonic poems ascribed to Orpheus, what has been overlooked is the inherent monistic theology that actually unifies these apparently different traditions. So again, we're going to see what I mean by that as we go on. But there is the cosmogony preserved in Eudemus, the peripatetic philosopher, that simply begins with night as the ultimate first principle, with earth and heaven, Uranus and Gaia, stemming from that monad of night. Now, the mock cosmogony present in Aristophanes' birds, that begins with chaos and Erebus, darkness, and night, Nyx, then leads to them producing an egg, and then time, the three seasons, as well as Eros, arise from that egg, and then from thence emanate the earth, the heaven, and the sea. Now, it's worth pointing out that Eros, as this egg-born first deity, along with time that comes out of the egg in this mock cosmogony that is found in Aristophanes' birds, what's interesting about this is that Eros, as we're going to see in later sources, namely in the writings preserved in Neoplatonist philosophers that belong to the rhapsodic theogony of Orpheus, in those texts, Eros is identified with Protogonus-Phanes, the egg-born created divinity of the Orphic religion. So the fact that Aristophanes has this mock cosmogony that he doesn't expressly ascribe to any poet, but it involves a certain Eros arising from an egg, and then the sectors of the universe, namely earth, heaven, and sea, emanating from that Eros, it would make sense then to presume that the unnamed poet whom Aristophanes is imitating and mocking is none other than Orpheus, and that the cosmogonic tradition that Aristophanes is presenting there in his birds in a comic fashion is actually the Orphic cosmogony of the egg-born, all-encompassing created divinity Eros / Protogonus-Phanes. And speaking of Eros as an all-encompassing, like egg-born created divinity, that leads us to Apollonius of Rhodes, who in his famous Argonautica, he has a little cosmogonic poem inserted there that's expressly ascribed to Orpheus. And in that tradition, it's clear that in that poem that Apollonius provides, strongly under the influence of Empedocles, there is a conception of the universe as like a singular sphere or ball, namely the Empedocles' conception of the Godhead, the monistic, all-encompassing Godhead, Sphiros, the great sphere, which can really be identified with the Orphic egg, right? That's really the same concept. And there too, as we know, that Empedocles conceives of the universe as a sphere that's brought together by love. Of course, Eros means love, but even though Empedocles uses the term philautes or philia, you have this ball or egg that arises when the universe is brought together by the force of love. But when the force of strife occurs, the egg, or sphere, we should say in Empedocles' terminology, falls apart. But this dynamic of unity in egg form or sphere form, and then disunity in breaking apart, I would submit is an inherently Orphic dynamic. And the reason that Apollonius of Rhodes, his Orpheus's cosmogony sounds so much like Empedocles is because I would submit that Empedocles was in turn borrowing cosmogony from the more ancient poet Orpheus. At any rate, Apollonius of Rhodes, as you see from the diagram, has this sphere monad dividing into the sectors of the cosmos, namely earth, heaven, and sea. And then he has several sets of rulers, and he makes mention of a certain Ophion, like a serpentine being whom Kronos does war with. That's described by Origen, the Christian writer, in his Contra Celsum, his text against the slanderous Celsus. And that's of note too, because there, when Origen's talking about the matter, he ascribes this battle between Ophion and Kronos to Pherecydes of Syros. And the reason that's significant is Pherecydes of Syros, a 6th century early thinker, is ascribed a cosmogonic poem wherein Kronos, time, is an early player. And again, time is the being who cracked open the Orphic egg, right? So again, we get another early figure who seems to be inspired, I would submit, by Orphic poetry. At any rate, then you've also got the diagram there of Hieronymus and Hellenicus, as well as Athenagoras, who's a Christian apologist, and all of them preserve a kind of peculiar materialistic version of this same Orphic cosmogony, wherein you have an egg being cracked open by time. Interestingly, in their later recension of this tradition that's more allegorical and elaborate because it's late, it identifies Kronos time with Heracles, presumably because the deeds of Heracles could be identified, well, were identified in the Hellenistic period with the zodiac. And so he was conceived of as like the cosmic man because he's cycling through all the symbols of the zodiac, embodies time itself. It's Porphyry who gives us that kind of allegorical interpretation. He preserves it. But at any rate, in that tradition, the egg splits. And from that splitting of the egg, heaven and earth arise, as well as Phanes. And then from there, all the divinities descend. So we'll get into the minutiae of how all these cosmogonies are to be conceived of as coming together. But that serves as a nice overview of the situation. So now we shall turn to what is in effect one of, if not the oldest sources we have for this ex ovo or egg-based creation story, and that is namely Aristophanes' birds. So he has a bird character say this in the play. I should give a bit of context. I'm not going to summarize the whole play, but in short, the play is about birds claiming that their origin is older than that of the Olympian gods, and that on account of that antiquity, they are entitled to be the true governors of the universe. And in that context of these birds arguing that they're the true, truly archaic divine rulers of the universe, not the Olympians, they submit this cosmogonic account involving an egg. And implicitly, the idea is that given that birds lay eggs, birds arise from eggs, if the universe was an egg initially, then that gives them this kind of cosmic seniority over other beings, right? So this is how that mock cosmogony put in the mouth of a bird begins. So that you may hear all these things from us and come to understand accurately the nature of the heavenly bodies, the meteora, as well as of the birds and / omens, Eornorn, right? Their genesis, you might come to understand the genesis, as well as the genesis of divinities, rivers, of Erebus, darkness, and of chaos. And then you might come to know correctly, you shall speak forth what I'm about to say. You are to learn it from me. And that it surpasses the kind of sophistry of the famed Protogonus. Now, that's kind of by intro. This is the actual text that we want to look at. This is how the cosmogonic account begins. Even though Aristophanes does not mention Orpheus expressly here in the text, the features we're going to see are markedly Orphic. Well, that'll make sense as we move along. But what is said in the text? So, first there was chaos, night, Erebus, darkness, and as well as, namely, this first dark Erebus, as well as the broad Tartarus. There was also earth, but, or rather, I should specify incorrect, neither earth nor air nor heaven existed yet. So the point is, there is only chaos, night, Erebus, the dark first one, wide Tartarus, namely the deepest layer of the underworld, right? And there was not yet any earth, nor air, nor heaven. So this is markedly different from Hesiod, right, who has chaos in the beginning, and he has Gaia and Tartarus and Eros as kind of early beings who are presumed in the first phase. That's not the case here. Earth, air, and heaven do not exist yet, but you do have Nyx, Chaos, Erebus, and Tartarus. Okay. Now, in the boundless embraces, or you could even say womb if you wanted, but not really, more like in the boundless embrace of Erebus, Nyx, that is Lady Night, who has black wings, she conceived first a wind egg, right? Now, it's a bit odd because a wind egg, right, is normally an egg that doesn't actually have a chicken in it, that just has wind. So this is a bit of a funny element of Aristophanes' poetry here, because it is a parody, a comedy, right? Okay, so, and from this wind egg arose the ever rotating around seasons, as well, and so too sprouted, right? A very vegetative word is used there, right? Eblasten, sprouted. It can even be embryonic as well, though. Sprouted Eros, the most desirable one. And he was glowing, stillborn, and on his back were gold wings. Okay, and he could be likened to, or had the appearance of, whirling winds. So this is highly significant because remember the Modena relief that I showed you at the beginning and how I mentioned just in passing the 4 winds in the corner, right? So the egg cracking and Eros / Protogonus-Phanes is associated with this bursting of winds. And remember, the whole point of the zodiac is that it symbolizes the year and the seasons. So Aristophanes, a classical period source, a very ancient source, already has this dynamic of a being, namely Eros, he calls him, arising from an egg, and the seasons being instituted by that egg cracking. And as we're going to see, earth and heaven forming through that egg cracking, all of which that all has the trappings of Orphic cosmogony. Okay, so back to the text now. So this one, namely Eros, mixed with the winged chaos along or according to wide Tartarus, and he hatched, a very bird-like word, he hatched, reared as a hen would an egg, so to speak, hatched / reared our race. Remember, it's a bird talking, so the race of birds who are senior to the gods in this comedy. So hatched our race, and brought us first into the light. Right? So like birds are saying they're the first creation. Okay. And that they're made by this winged divinity Eros, who arose from an egg, and that egg was birthed by Nyx, Night, who is herself winged as well, and thus is implicitly bird-like. So at first there was not a race of immortals before Eros mixed together all things. And as various things were mixed with other things, the heaven was born, as well as the ocean and the earth and the incorruptible race of the blessed gods. So Eros, the egg-born divinity, is the creator divinity implicitly, because he arises from the egg, and then all of a sudden, it's not expressly said he created, but all of a sudden arises the gods and all the elements of the cosmos, like the heaven, the sea, and the earth. Okay. And it's interesting to know, right, that this is a comedy and a parody, and yet look how critical this little parodic episode is for our reconstruction of ancient Greek cosmogony. It plays a vital role, even though it is a parody that we have preserved here. It still gives us an idea of what was the serious Orphic conception. Okay, so back to the text. So we are here, and we are the most elderly of all the blessed ones. And that's in short, like all we need to translate there. Diogenes Laertius, in his Lives of the Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers, it's interesting. He mentions that there was a certain cosmogonic poet called Linos. Now, Linos, as we're going to see, like Orpheus, is an ancient musician bard. And he, as we're going to see, was ascribed certain cosmogonic poems as well. And he, according to Linus, that is, this Orpheus-like character who perhaps is even related to Orpheus, he is said to have said that in his cosmogonic poetry, he has a line, the incipit, in fact, the incipit, that is the beginning, the first line, which is a highly significant line, the first line. He has him, Diogenes Laertius asserts that Linus began his cosmogonic poem with the line, there was once this time, Chronos, in whom all things sprouted or arose. That's supposed to say punter, not munt. Moves a typo there. But this is highly significant because provided Diogenes Laertius is actually quoting a genuinely archaic text as opposed to a like Hellenistic forgery, which is what modern people would presume. But if it is actually an ancient poem that's preserved there in Diogenes Laertius, then that would mean that you had ascribed to Linus already in deep antiquity this conception of all of time sprouting and time being identified with the universe. And that's highly significant because if you recall from the Timaeus, Plato there in the Timaeus has his demiurge, his creator divinity, create the universe / time based on the model of the paradigm eternity. So time is the visible image of invisible eternity. But in so framing things, he essentially implies that time and the universe are birthed together, and time essentially is the universe. You can identify the two. And that's, I think, something implicit in the Orphic cosmogony. And we don't have to worry about the dating of this Linus line, the opening of Linus's poem, because I think already implicit in Aristophanes' mock poem, that is definitely of the classical period, already we have there this idea that time and the constituent parts of the universe arise together out of the egg, because it's mentioned that the seasons, the rotating seasons, that's just another way of saying time, right, is connected to the hatching of the egg and the beginning of the arising of the creator divinity, there called Eros. Okay, now, let us turn now to the most ancient surviving book in today's terms from ancient Europe. And when I say the most ancient book, what I literally mean is the artifact presently surviving that can be called a book. I mean, it's more literally a papyrus scroll, but it is the oldest physically surviving ancient text that we have in our possession today. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was the first thing ever written in Europe, but it is the first it is the oldest physically existing European text that we currently own and are aware of. Hopefully that makes sense. So in it it preserves a cosmogonic poem that is ascribed to Orpheus. It doesn't just include that one, it also hints at other cosmological poetry by Orpheus that it mentions, makes slight reference to, even though it doesn't preserve those poems. And even the poem which it preserves a portion of, it only preserves a fragment, a part of that. But then in addition to this poem ascribed to Orpheus or by Orpheus, it has this papyrus fragment has a lot of interlineary commentary explaining the Orphic poem. And that commentary is by an anonymous author, an exegete, right? A hieratic exegete, that is to say, a priestly explainer of ancient literature, in this case, Orphic poetry. So that'll make more sense as we go on. We'll disambiguate first what is the actual poem, cosmogonic poem ascribed to Orpheus in this document, the Derveni Papyrus, and then we'll look at what the commentator says about the poem, and we'll look at how the two strains can be differentiated, namely the poem itself and the commentary on the poem by this anonymous classical period ancient thinker. And it's typically presumed in modernity that the commentator is like butchering the text and giving it meanings that weren't intended, but I actually don't think so. I actually, having come from a bit of a background in Indology and looking at the way the Upanishads and the Brahmanas, or the priestly commentaries on ancient hymns, when you look at them in that context, rather than butchering or changing the intended meaning of the ancient text, they actually really do help to illuminate what was intended, I submit. That's considered a very radical position in modernity to hold. But we're going to see it through, as we walk through this stuff, how it all comes together, and how rather than butchering the Orphic poem, the anonymous commentator whose interlinear comments are preserved in the papyrus actually helps us to fully understand what is meant by the poem. His allegorical exegesis is not an arbitrary superimposition that distorts the poem, but rather is a true inspired exegesis that helps us properly understand what Orpheus intended. Radical claim, but you'll see it firsthand. Okay, so what's in this cosmogony? We will look at the whole thing, but before we look at it, in short, the real punchline of it is it has this particular word that I've particular phrase, I should say, that I've transliterated here, Protogonus-Phanes aidoiou, right? Which means what? Well, it has two potential meanings depending on how you construe aidoiou, right? So it could either mean of the genitals of the firstborn king, or it could mean of the reverend or revered firstborn king. Because aidoiou, it can either be aidoion, the neuter noun meaning genitalia, or it could be the adjective aidoios in the genitive, and that adjective in hymnic language, in ancient hymns, aidoios means like revered or reverend as a cult epithet of deities. Okay. So there is an inherent ambiguity there that has led to confusion amongst modern commentators. Now, just before I dive into the actual Orphic cosmogonic poem fragment that is preserved in this papyrus text, I just want to briefly comment on the context in which it was found. Basically, this text was uncovered in funerary remains from an area, Derveni, in northern Greece. You can see the Derveni crater, that is the mixing bowl, which is a funerary urn that was discovered in the same site as the papyrus fragments themselves. It seems as if the papyrus scroll was burnt with the cremated body of the deceased, presumably for apotropaic reasons. That is, given that the text makes mention of like evil spirits that attack the souls of the dead, it seems like the text was an offering to appease the spirits and to please the gods and to assist the deceased person in their afterlife journey. the papyrus text makes mention of the idoion, that is either the genitalia or the reverend divinity, it's unclear which of the two is meant, being swallowed, katepinen, and then is specified, he who first jumped into the ether. Now, the fact that we're dealing with a being who's jumping into the ether suggests that idoion means the reverend one, and thus refers to a divinity rather than being genitalia. But it's complicated by the fact that ektore, in addition to meaning leapt, jumped, can also mean ejaculated, right? So in this case, there's an inherent ambiguity there. But rather than having to choose between, well, does that mean that there are genitalia being swallowed by Zeus, or rather there is some reverend being who jumped first into the ether? I think it's possible that the poet is playing on the inherent ambiguity of the verb to jump, which can also mean to ejaculate, and reverend one, which can also mean genitalia. And there is a deliberate ambiguity whereby it could be a severed genital falling down, like in Hesiod's famous story of Cronus castrating Uranus, or it could be this ether-born egg divinity, Protogonus-Phanes, first leaping into being. And both are being identified because both are all-containing divinities. Uranus is the outer rim of the spherical world who contains all things. He is everything. Heaven is everything because he contains everything. And likewise, Protogonus-Phanes, the Orphic created divinity born of the ethereal egg who leapt into being, also contain everything. And given that there is this identification between these two all-containing divine beings, namely heaven, Uranus, and Protogonus-Phanes, I think Orpheus the poet here puns on that by identifying the two, Uranus whose genitals were severed in the Hesiodic account, but also his own egg-born, all-encompassing created divinity who first leapt into the world out of the ethereal egg that hatched. So let us turn now to the poem of Orpheus as it is preserved in the Derveni Papyrus that you see there. That is the actual papyrus itself, the fragments laid out. The text is quite clear there in that facsimile. So what I have produced here is from Martin Litchfield West. He has produced an edition of the Orphic poem from the Derveni Papyrus that has all of the interlineary commentary removed. So what we have here boiled down, that I'm going to do a live translation of, is the Orphic poem itself. And then we'll look at the comments of the commentator separately. But for now, we'll disambiguate the text by just looking at the poem and not addressing the commentary, because the papyrus itself, right, is a mixture of both original poem and inserted commentary. But I've differentiated, I've separated them so that we can do a more thorough reading of the Orphic poem itself before addressing the issue of the commentator's perspective. Okay, so how does it begin? It begins with, I shall sing unto the wise. May those who are profane or contaminated, may they place doors upon their ears. Now this phrase, place doors upon your ears, close the gates of your ears, O ye profane ones, that Orphic ritual phrase actually occurs in Plato's Symposium as well, just before the famous revelation of Socrates as this kind of like divine statue that contains all the statues of the gods. Now, incidentally, if you know from my Timaeus talk, you know that the demiurge of Plato in the Timaeus, the creator god, who beholds the all-containing paradigm and kind of noetically ingests that paradigm and creates the visible world, that being, that creator god, is said to create the universe as an agalma, as a statue. So how interesting that then Plato depicts Socrates as this cosmic agalma statue that contains all the agalmata statues of the gods. And he does so, and he introduces that passage by using this ritual formula of close the gates of thy ears, O ye profane ones. That to me indicates that his conception of Socrates as the cosmic statue that contains all the divine statues, and his conception of, and Plato's conception of the creator god of the Timaeus, a demiurge, an artisan who creates the world as a statue containing all statues. That conception, I would suggest, must be borrowed from Orpheus, because we're going to see the same conception is found here in this poem, and it's introduced with that same ritual phrase of, "O ye profane ones, close the gates of thy ears." But anyway, so that's how it begins, and then the poem truly starts. The divine deeds of Zeus, who is the Lord who ruleth over all, he did them according to the speech of the dark Nyx, that is Lady Night. And the eternal race of the younger blessed divinities who always exist, they were birthed from Zeus, the king of great might, right? So in plain English, Orpheus the poet simply stating that Zeus did these divine works under the verbal instruction of Nyx, of night, and that the race of divinities, i.e. the Olympians, known to people at that time, were all birthed from Zeus. Zeus is the great father, and he did so by following the instructions of Nyx, who implicitly exists before him and must therefore be the ultimate source of the universe, the arche, as we saw in Eudemus earlier. But at any rate, back to the text. So then Zeus received the divinely promulgated rule from his own father by taking into his hands the scepter, and then he intended to speak all things well, and then the goddess, i.e. Nyx, who is the Ambrosian nurse of the gods, she said the following as a prophetess. She, in an oracular fashion, said all these things which it would be cosmic justice, it would be like meet, it would be fitting, it would establish order in the cosmos for Zeus to do these things, to accomplish them, these things that she is promulgating as a prophetess, in order that Zeus might come to rule upon the beautiful snowy throne of Olympus. Now, Zeus then, having heard these divine promulgations, ineffable promulgations of the goddess Nyx, night, he then seized in his hands the might, Alcan, the power, that is the glorious divinity, the daimona kudron. So Zeus seizes this random glorious divinity who is might in his hands, and then it is said, and swallows the Idoion that first jumped into the ether. Now you can see why I think that this being who is seized by Zeus's hands and is consumed, this being who's said to have first jumped into the ether, is most likely Protogonus, who's being referenced here through the adjective idoios being used as a substantive. So he seizes the reverend one in his hands, that reverend one who first jumped into the ether. Because there's no reference of the castration here in the text that people superimpose on the poem. Now, that's not to say that Hesiod's narrative of heaven, Uranus being castrated by Kronos, is totally irrelevant and isn't being hinted at here by the poet Orpheus. No, it's quite possible that this deliberately obscure phraseology of the reverend one that also looks like the genitalia is done by Orpheus with the deliberate intention of hinting at that story preserved in Hesiod of the castration of heaven. Hence why the word for to leap also means to ejaculate, right? There is a deliberate double meaning of genitalia at play. But I just don't think it's sound to infer that Zeus is swallowing the severed penis of heaven when there's no mention of that castration per se. It makes more sense to presume that it's the reverend one, the Idoios, namely Protogonus-Phanes. And then what do we see in the text? Then he, that is Zeus, this one, Zeus, birthed Gaia, earth, and Uranos, heaven, the wide one, wide heaven. And then the mighty or enormous Gaia, earth, gave birth to Kronos. And Cronus, he was the one who then did great works. Now, people presume that he did great works is an allusion to the fact that he, in the Hesiodic tradition, castrated his father. And I don't have an issue with people bringing that into the equation. But notice it doesn't expressly say that, anything about the castration. All it says is that he did great works. Okay, the text goes on. So Uranos, who's called Euphronides, that is the son of Euphrone, which we typically presume Euphrone is just like another title of Nyx. So Uranos is a child of Nyx in this poem. So Uranos, the son of Nyx, was the first one to rule as a king. Now, this line is what leads people to presume that it must be that Zeus is swallowing the genitalia of Uranos because he's specified as the first king, and they presume, he must be the one who first leapt into the ether. But that is not necessarily the case. Protogonus-Phanes could be the referent. He could be the one who arose from the ethereal egg and jumped into being, and he just wasn't called a ruler per se, a king, and that Uranos, a later being who arose from the egg that Protogonus busted, right, that he was the first ruler, right? Why do we need to presume that there was no being before Uranos just because he ruled first? That's a non sequitur. At any rate, the text goes on. From him, Uranos, arose Kronos, and then later the wily or intelligent Zeus, and the epithet there for intelligent is Metieta, and we have in that component Metis. That's a significant detail, note that. Remember, in the Hesiodic tradition, Zeus swallows Metis and then a divine female personage, and then births Athena out of his head, right? So note that epithet. Again, I think Orpheus is hinting at Hesiodic material and incorporating it, even though he's saying a different narrative. Okay, so then the text goes on. Now, Metis possessed the kingly or royal honor of the gods. So this is interesting, even though the text just said that Uranos, son of Nyx, was the first one to rule. It then also says that the kingly honor was ascribed to Metis. Metis is a different being, okay? And yet Metis has kingly honor, i.e. is ruling. Now, what's going on there? Well, first and foremost, as we'll note later on, Metis is another title of Protogonus-Phanes in the Orphic rhapsodies of later times. Is it not possible that conception existed in deep antiquity as well? I think so, and I think it's attested right here in the text. I think what the text here of the Derveni Papyrus is saying is that the first ruler was Metis, who is also Uranos, and who is also the one who first arose from the egg, namely Protogonus-Phanes. Notice the egg isn't expressly mentioned here in the text that we have in front of us in the Derveni Papyrus, but that doesn't preclude the egg from being part of the conception just because it's not mentioned expressly. At any rate, what happens here? So Metis is, I think, like a female avatar or a female half of Protogonus-Phanes, who is also night, I would suggest, in my interpretation. Now, I don't think that it's an issue that we can identify heaven and Metis and and night and Protogonus-Phanes all together, because end of the day, they all are the same body, all-encompassing body, namely the spherical heaven, the night sky, the egg, the ethereal egg that constitutes the plenitude of the universe. Okay, back to the text. So, and then he swallowed the menos, the might of the divinity. And this was justice, this was themis, this was the dharma, so to speak, that's a cognate, the establishment of cosmic order, okay? And then it continues, the menos, that is the might of the firstborn king's idoion, or, right, that is genitalia. So normally the way modern scholars translate this is, then Zeus swallowed the might of the god, as was the mandate of cosmic justice, and the god being the firstborn king's genitals. But notice in translating it that way, they're not correctly translating the apposition of the sentence, right? What he said is Zeus swallows the menos of the god, right? The might of the divinity. And then it says, and then with respect to that divinity who's in the genitive, that divinity is the firstborn, Protogonus, who is a king. And I think Idoiou here, Idoiou is an adjective, the reverend king. Zeus swallowed the might of the god. The god was namely Protogonus, the reverend king. You can call him the firstborn king because his name Protogonos means the firstborn, but it should be capitalized as Martin West does in his edition there. Notice here's capital Pi, Protogonu Basileos Idoiou, the genitalia of the firstborn king. But rather than that all being in apposition to genitive theou, it's all relates to the menos. So the menos of the god, the menos of the of Protogonus, the noble king. But it's deliberately syntactically ambiguous because I think Orpheus also wants to hint at the severed genitalia of Hesiod's tradition. I don't think that should be excluded. But there's a double meaning. What we shouldn't do is in fixating on that element, we shouldn't overlook the presence of the divinity Protogonus. Certainly Martin West deems Protogonus-Phanes to be here in the text because he capitalizes Protogonos to show that it is a theonym, it is a god's name. It's not merely an adjective meaning firstborn, even though, of course, the god name does mean firstborn. And then the text goes on. All of the immortal ones, that is, the blessed gods and goddesses, sprouted out from this entity that was just alluded to, okay? So in other words, all the divinities are part of this idoion, part of this either genitalia or part of Protogonus-Phanes who swallowed, okay? And not only the gods and goddesses sprouted from this entity, but also the rivers, the springs of water, right, the wells, that are much desired and lovely, and in short, all of the things that have been begotten. He was singular when he was begotten. So i.e. he was like a monistic, a monad. He was an all-encompassing entity. This Protogonus-Phanes, the idoion, the reverend one, whom Zeus swallows. Okay? And then the text goes on. Now that he has swallowed, he is the king of all things, of everything. He is, he shall be, and he later shall be. He is, he was, and he later shall be. There's like a tripartite element of past, present, and future. And then there's a hymn now within the cosmogony. There's a Zeus hymn composed by Orpheus, and it says, Zeus was born first. Zeus is the last one, he of bright lightning. Zeus is the head and the middle, and from Zeus all things were architecturally designed or begotten. Really, tetuktai means like architecturally designed, even though he's birthing. If you remember my Timaeus talk, in that creation story, artisanal creation and biological birthing are mixed, much as they are here. I would again submit that's an Orphic concept. So he's the head, he's the middle. From him, all things were created. Zeus is also the end of all things, or rather, Zeus possesses the end, holds the end of all things. And Zeus is also the powerful Moira. Zeus is king, Zeus is ruler, Zeus of the white lightning is ruler of all things. Now, there's a bit to unpack here. Notice that Zeus is also identified as Moira, that is fate, Lady Fate, a divine being, a female divine being. So that's odd. Zeus is called Lady Fate. Implicitly, in my interpretation of the text, Orpheus is insinuating that Zeus is a hermaphroditic creator being, much like Protogonus-Phanes in the later texts that we'll look at. And it makes sense. If Zeus swallowed the hermaphroditic creator deity who contains all things, he would himself become an all-containing hermaphroditic being like the one whom he swallowed. And that's just like I said, Phanes and Nyx, night, were the two halves of the hermaphroditic Protogonus. So too I would submit that Zeus is the male half and Moira the female half of this new all-containing divinity that Zeus who swallows Protogonus-Phanes. And so he's the beginning, the middle, and the end, i.e. he's the totality of all things because he swallowed the one who contained all things. That's what makes me think it's Protogonus-Phanes, the reverend one whom Zeus swallows, rather than the severed genitalia of Uranos, because Protogonus-Phanes is the macranthrope, right? He's the humanoid being who contains the totality of all things within himself. And so it makes sense that Zeus could only accomplish what Nyx instructed him to do, namely to recreate the universe, by becoming pregnant with all things in order to birth all things anew. And you can only become pregnant with all things if you swallow the one who is the totality of all things, namely Protogonus-Phanes. Now you can say Uranos is the totality of all things, but the severed genitalia would only be a part of the one who is all things, not the totality of all things. It doesn't really make sense that, the genitalia would result in someone being pregnant with all things. You would need to swallow the totality of all things to become pregnant with all things. That makes sense. So continuing the poem, Zeus hid all things and then again brought them into the much happy light and brought them forth from his holy heart. And he made his thoughts action. Okay, so what's going on here? In other words, everything was existing. It all was hidden inside of Zeus's belly for a while, and then it was brought back into the light yet again, out of his heart, out of his belly, when he birthed the world anew. And it's interesting that he makes his thoughts action, as if to say his pregnancy is a kind of cognitive pregnancy. He's the all-containing mind who assimilates all the ideas, and then he births all the ideas again, this time as material actualities, which is interesting because there is a Platonic conception, right, of the noetic, perfect, all-containing animal existing invisibly, non-materially, and then a divinity kind of ingesting those ideas, so to speak, the demiurge, and then crafting a physical, visible world. And I think that same dynamic is at play here in the Derveni cosmogony. Okay, so going on with the text. So then later, the first of the divinities, namely golden Aphrodite, the heavenly one, Aphrodite Urania, this erotically desirous one was conceived, like mentally conceived, but also generated through his ejaculate. Again, this word thorner is related to the verb to ejaculate or jump that we encountered earlier when the Idoion first entered the ether. It ekthore, now we have thorner, this ejaculate. So the implicit thing is like the pregnant Zeus like kind of ejaculates Aphrodite, the heavenly one, into existence. And of course, there's the connection with the Hesiotic narrative from the theogony of Uranus's genitals being severed and falling into the sea, and the foam of the sea birthing Aphrodite, right? That's implicit here, but not expressly said. Okay? And then it says, and along with her was also born the desirous Harmonia, as well as Peitho, that is Lady Persuasion, these two divinities as well. Then Zeus conceived of Gaia and of wide Uranos, heaven, and then conceived of the great might of the wide flowing Oceanus. And then there's mention of the membranes, or like the sinews of the silver eddying Achelous, who's a river deity. Okay, so the great cosmic waters are also being conceived by Zeus as he kind of births the world anew from his all-containing pregnancy. And he conceived of, and I'm deliberately using conceived to capture the double pun of he thinks into existence, but he also births into existence. It's a kind of genesis of cognition from the great cosmic mind Zeus. Okay, so and that's in the poem, not even in the exegetical commentary of the anonymous commentator. Okay, so Zeus, births yet another earth, another Gaia, this earth having no limit per se, and is namely called Selene, that is moon. So the immortal gods call her anyway, but we earthly beings, we earthlings, call her Mene. So these two words for moon, okay? One of man, one of gods. And this moon, this second earth, right? So Orpheus speaks of the moon as another earth. This second earth has many mountains, many cities, many palatial dwellings, and from the middle expands out with equally proportioned members that on all sides. That is to say, is perfectly spherical. That's the same language Parmenides uses for the spherical cosmos, which is interesting because we'll later see as well that in my submission, Orphic cosmogonic poetry is associated with the belief that the universe was spherical, which is found in pre-Socratic thinkers, and I would argue was potentially inherited from Orphic cosmogonic poetry, or Orphic cosmogonic poetry arose in the same context as the speculation of the pre-Socratic philosophers about the spherical earth. And it makes sense, right? Because remember, the egg is the source of the of the Orphic cosmogony, right? And an egg is kind of roundish, okay? Or can be at any rate. So, yeah, so the moon, the text goes on, the moon has that equal sphere shape unto all, and it is apparent and shines unto all mortals who are upon this earth, okay? And then Zeus, conceives of the great sun, which is a great boon for all mortals, as well as the shining stars that crown heaven, like it form a circular crown of heaven, okay? Remember that zodiac pattern, the star symbols of the Modena relief with Protogonus-Phanes coming out of the egg. I think, and remember the seasons being instituted by the hatching of the egg in Aristophanes, okay? I think all of that is implicit in the subtext here, okay? All these things are the wise, the clever Zeus conceived of, and then he came to mix sexually in love with his own mother, okay? Now, who that mother is, we don't know. Of course, the Hesiotic tradition, according with that, it would be Rhea, but in this case, is it Nyx? It's unclear. But I think there is an implicit henotheism in this whole theology. Henotheism being the idea that there is one Godhead with many divinities within that Godhead, okay? And so in such a system, who's who is very fluid because they're all actors within one unified divine body, Okay, does that make sense? All right. Now we're going to turn to the commentator whose comments on this Derveni poem are preserved in the Derveni Papyrus as well in an interlinear sort of fashion. Okay. So the commentator says about, in this papyrus, says about Orpheus that all of his poetry is enigmatic. That is, it's deliberately riddling. It's deliberately unclear and ambiguous and has lots of nuances that have to be brought out through a kind of examination of the underlying riddles. And so he says, it is necessary for every word to be examined as if it's a riddle. That's what the commentator says. So that's interesting. The commentator believes that the text is a very nuanced, deliberately mystagogic and mysterious kind of oracle that needs to be interpreted through allegories. And modern people read that and think, all right, so he's just superimposing all these arbitrary allegorical interpretations of his and claims that they were all intended by Orpheus. But why should we take it that way? Why not actually take it at face value and say, yes, this commentator is correct. This is a highly philosophically nuanced text, and there were intended meanings that had to be brought out through exegesis. I don't think there's anything wrong with presuming that. What makes people presume, though, that the commentator is not reliable and has arbitrary interpretations is the following. The commentator says, with respect to the last line that has Zeus copulating with his mother, he says that those who do not understand this word or this phrase, namely his own mother, they take it as meaning that, when in actuality it means something else. That is, heas, the word his own mother, should actually be interpreted as meaning good, not his own. That is, he copulated with the good mother, not his own mother. So here, the commentator is engaging in this kind of defensive allegoresis, right? So because he doesn't want the Godhead to be guilty of incest, he reinterprets it as not being his own mother, rather the good mother. So people say, oh, because he has this defensive mode of interpretation that does mental gymnastics in order to make the story more savory and less sinful, he's not an honest interpreter of Orpheus. But that's a non sequitur. Who's to say? Perhaps Orpheus deliberately was trying to create a cosmogony that, unlike Orpheus and Homer that are very crude and rude, he was trying to create one that, through puns, could be given a more nuanced and less positive, a more nuanced and more positive meaning, right? A kind of a cosmogonic account that correlates in its kind of violence and bizarre patterns with all the other accounts, but has wording that enables it to be deliberately interpreted in a more cleaner allegorical fashion, right? Is it not conceivable that an archaic poet could deliberately structure his poems in such a way as to relate to the other archaic poems and telling a similar story, but be more suggestive of a more nuanced monistic theology that could be interpreted in a way that's less carnal and violent? Is that not conceivable? Okay. Now, the commentator also says that Orpheus imagistically likens the sun to genitalia. So, in other words, he interprets the mention of Idoion, that is the reverend one, or the genitals, he takes that to be an allegorical reference to the sun. And again, modern scholars will say, see, the commentator is doing a wild and arbitrary, bizarre, scientific and moral allegorical exegesis that has nothing to do with what the archaic Orpheus poet intended. But that's not necessarily so, because as we'll see later on, Protogonus-Phanes, as his name suggests, Phanes, the shining one, was actually identified with the sun. So it could just be a matter of the allegoresis here, or the interpretation here, is just simply identifying that Protogonus-Phanes, the shining egg-born ethereal divinity, is to be identified with the sun as well. Now, the commentator in the Derveni Papyrus says that he, Orpheus, calls the Idoion, the genitalia, or the reverend one, the sun, because what is being conveyed is the following, namely that all of the things that currently exist arose from it. That is to say, the sun birthed all things that currently exist. And also, in the same manner, genitalia are like the source of all genesis of organisms, okay? But again, none of this interpretation that's scientizing, so to speak, in making the sun the source of all life and linking of the sun to human genitalia and this kind of analogism, none of that exegesis precludes the idea that there was an Orphic created divinity, Protogonus-Phanes, who arose from the egg, who was also identified with a kind of noetic sun. Right? None of that is impossible. Then the commentator also says that this one, namely Chronos with a K or C, not time, but Chronos, he is said to have arisen from the sun unto earth, okay? For he is the reason or the cause for, that is namely, the sun is the reason or the cause for all things knocking into each other. And the verb there for knocking is kruestai, right? Kruo means to like bump or knock. So the idea is there's a scientific allegoresis happening here, whereby the commentator is saying the sun causes all genesis and the sun causes all movement and all things to bump into each other. And that movement that is caused by the sun, that kruoin movement, is Chronos, is the divinity Chronos, who is like the mover. Okay? So there's some scientific allegoresis occurring and punning on the god names in the commentary. But who's to say that this wasn't part of the original monistic cosmology of the poet Orpheus, right? Why do we have to assume that this allegoresis is an offensive affront to the intended meaning of the poem? It's not necessarily so. Here you can see the actual tomb wherein the Derveni Papyrus was found in the photograph, incidentally. But we'll look a bit more at some of the kind of comments that the Derveni commentator makes on the Derveni poem that I translated just before. So the commentator also says that as we see in as we ourselves see, right, or as I see, the genesis or generation of humans occurs in or happens through their genitalia. And without genitals, nothing could be generated, nothing could arise. And for this reason, right, the poet makes use of this word eidoion and likens the sun imagistically to the genitals. Okay, but again, given that Protogonus-Phanes is a kind of solar shining divinity, there's no reason to presume this. I think that this scientific allegoresis being conducted by the hieratic exegete, right, the priestly explainer of the text, it's in accordance with the intentions of the poet, not against the intentions of the poet. Okay. He also says that Olympus and time, Chronos with a CH, are one and the same thing. Now, this is highly significant. Plato, in his Epinomis, makes mention of the fact that Olympus was another title for Uranos as the all-containing divinity, okay? And notice that in the Timaeus, time, Chronos, is identified with the visible universe, the totality of all things, okay? So implicit in all of this, I think, is that in the Orphico-Pythagorean conception of the universe, heaven is a singular, all-encompassing divinity who can also be called Olympus, and I would venture to say it can also be called Protogonus-Phanes, but that's not in the text. But can also be called time, Chronos, and as we'll see in the later recensions of Orphic cosmogonic poetry, right, Chronos as this snake who wraps around the ethereal egg and cracks it open has common characteristics with Protogonus-Phanes, because the snake time, Chronos with a CH, has all these animalian zodiacal constellational heads on his body. And if you recall from the Modena relief, Protogonus-Phanes also has those animal heads on his chest. So there's a sense in which Chronos fathers the ethereal egg from which Protogonus hatches, and the sun is kind of like of the same essence of the Father, right? Protogonus-Phanes and Chronos, Father Time, and the ethereal egg are all kind of one and the same and can be identified with Uranos in the sense of the spherical egg-shaped totality of the all, right? Now, many would object to me using these later conceptions of Orphic cosmology to interpret this Derveni Papyrus because it doesn't say a lot of these things. But I think hopefully you can find my exegesis compelling. And when we later get to those later texts and look back on this Derveni Papyrus, hopefully it might all come together in a persuasive way. Now, the commentator also says that Oceanus, i.e. the ocean, is the air. Okay, so the commentator is interpreting the alleged ocean of the Orphic poet/poem with the air. Okay, so there's this interesting crossing of elements in the interpretation, but in a monistic framework wherein you have a quintessential element, namely ether, from which all the sublunar elements stem, it makes sense that you could explain things in this way. Okay, space, or the heavens as a sea, is not altogether an alien concept. We know from the book of Genesis that when God separates the waters from the waters, he's talking about the structuring of heaven. Okay, so it's the same sort of thing. It's a very archaic conception. Space or heaven as a sea, right? As an ocean. The commentator also says that nous, intelligence, mind, is the mother of all other things. So the commentator is interpreting Zeus as the mother of all things as mind. But again, that's not necessarily a superimposition on the text. It could be that Orpheus the poet intended this all to be construed as a mind-based noetic cosmology. After all, he thinks the world into being, mersator, right? He conceives, not just in the sense of birthing, but he thinks the world into being. So implicitly, if someone's this grand, all-encompassing divinity who thinks the world into being, he is the all-containing mind who mothers all things. That exegesis is not, a distortion of the text. It's what the text says anyway. It's a clarification. So the commentator says that Orpheus names him Chronos with a C or a K, right? Not time, but the Titan Chronos, names him so because he is the kruon tartonon. He is the one who shapes or moves nous, okay? And then the commentator says that this spirit Orpheus named Moira, or that is Lady Fate. And he says, the commentator says, and Orpheus calls this cognition, this phronesis, this thought, calls it Moira. Now, some may object, but I would interpret that exegesis by the commentator as being related to Plato's Cratylus, okay? So in Plato's Cratylus, we get these explanations of etymologies, of the meanings of the origins of words, and there he explains phronesis, cognition, as related to the word phora, rotational, circular rotation. Now, the heavens rotate circularly, and Zeus, as the all-containing heavens, is a rotating heavenly sphere, okay? And fate is conceived of, in ancient terms, as our fate written in the stars, right? The rotating stars of heaven. And there's like a kind of wind in the sense that, all of the rotating celestial realm is like a kind of vortex. It's a kind of tornado, right? So implicit in the poetry and the priestly exegete's interpretation of the Orphic poem is this conception of a single divine mind shaking all things about and instituting a kind of rotational cognition that is the fated stars. And this relates to, so you can see how that etymology in Plato's Cratylus of phronesis, rotational cognition, helps us make sense of Orpheus here. And I don't think that's me misapplying Plato to a separate tradition, because I think that the etymologies that Plato preserves in the Cratylus are stemming from Euthyphro, who in turn is an Orphic exegete, much like the one whose comments are preserved in the Derveni Papyrus. Indeed, It's unlikely, but it's possible that the comments preserved in the Derveni Papyrus may have even been authored by Euthyphro himself, whose theology informs Plato's book, the Cratylus. Now, in addition to the phronesis meaning coming from phora, that is rotation, being circulating cognition, the other thing that is disclosed from the Cratylus text is there he etymologizes, Plato, I should say, acting in the Orphic tradition, etymologizes the theonym or god name Kronos with a C or a K, the Titan Kronos. He relates it to a phrase, kuros katharunos, meaning a son of the pure mind. But what's interesting there is the nos part of Kronos in Plato's exegesis and in the Derveni Papyrus is in both instances that god name is linked to nous, mind, the divine mind. In the Cratylus, Zeus's two names, Dias and Zden, are etymologized or explained in terms of to live, Zden, and Dia, through. He is the one through whom all things live. So what I'm getting at here is in all these theological Orphic puns, there is this implicit henotheistic cosmology, right, wherein there is one Godhead, nous, the divine mind, who moves kruein, right, who shakes about or who rotates the heaven which contains all things. And that informs the way the traditional god names are interpreted to fit that preconception, right? So in order to prove that this kind of allegorical mode of interpretation is very ancient, I just wanted to briefly make mention of a certain figure called Metrodorus. And he was famed for his bizarre treatment of the Iliad, wherein he interpreted certain characters as representing elements of the cosmos and of human anatomy. So this Metrodorus lived in the 5th century, okay? And we are told in the Suda, which is like an 11th century Byzantine encyclopedia, in that encyclopedia for the entry about Agamemnon, we encounter this. Metrodorus interpreted the ether allegorically. So Metrodorus of Lampsacus, in his text concerning Homer or about Homer, i.e. an allegorical treatment of Homeric poetry, in that text, he treats all things allegorically, renders them into allegory. So neither Hera nor Athena or Deus, that is Zeus, are as they are in Homeric poetry, as they truly are as these, humanoids, but rather instead they are said to be like the groves and temples which were consecrated to them. They are hypostases of nature, and they are arrangements of elements. That is to say, right, that Metrodorus identified the Homeric gods not as these arbitrary humanoids as they appear in the plain meaning of the poem, but rather he interpreted them in an elemental way as constituent elements of the cosmos through his particular means of allegoresis. But not only that, but even Hector and Achilles, as well as Agamemnon, in short, all of the barbarians and Greeks of the poem, along with Helen and Paris, he also interpreted them as existing as elements of the natural world on account of his structuring, his allegorical structure of interpretation. And he imposed that into the poetry, such that none of those aforementioned characters, Paris and Helen and so on, were actually people, but rather instead he interprets them as like body humans, okay? So that I just brought up to simply show that there were odd allegorical exegetes who were treating Homer in a way that's quite counterintuitive and seems to be superimposing meanings on the on the ancient bard Homer that probably or most likely were not intended by him when he composed his poetry. But that shouldn't be used as an argument to claim that the Derveni commentator is butchering the Orpheus poem in the Derveni Papyrus, because it's possible that the Orphic tradition was different and was actually composed with deliberate complex puns and allegorical meanings in mind, because it is a more philosophic tradition of poetry that arose later than Homer. Okay. Now, the last text that we'll look at today before I close this session is that Plato's Cratylus makes reference to Homer's Iliad, which identifies Oceanus and Tethys as the genesis of all the gods, right? As the arche, or the original principle from whom all things emanate. But he also claims that Orpheus puts forward this view. So what is said? So there in the Cratylus at Stephanus, page 402b, Plato says this: just as Homer says that Oceanus is the genesis of the gods and of all the gods, right? And that Tethys is their mother. And I think so also Hesiod. And indeed, Orpheus also says that Oceanus was the first, Oceanus, the one of beautiful flowing, right, was the first one who instituted marriage with his own sister from the same womb, namely Tethys. So what Plato is saying here, right, is that Homer, apparently Hesiod, and Orpheus all identify Oceanus, the ocean, as the source of all Genesis. Now, hold on a minute, what's going on there? Hesiod does mention Oceanus the Titan, but he's not the first being, he's not the source of all things. Homer says that. Now, Orpheus, does he say that? I mean, technically all Plato says that he says that Oceanus was the first one to institute marriage, which is not the same thing as being the source of all the divinities and of all things. But I think what Plato is hinting at here is the reason he can identify all these traditions when they actually aren't the same is that when you are thinking in an Orphic way in terms of all divinities and all visible things being part of the body of one super deity, right, one henotheistic, all-containing super deity, well, in that kind of a worldview, you can be very flexible in determining who is the first source of all things, and you can also reinterpret Oceanus, the great all-containing ocean, as being as being space, right? As being the swirling heavenly ocean that is all things. Note that the Derveni commentator said that Oceanus is the air, right? And air is like kind of the ether of the egg of Protogonus. There's this monistic tradition in which everything can kind of be identified and conflated messily, but it's theologically sound, right? Because we're living in a world wherein there's lots of divinities who are all part of one unifying monad, a super divinity, right? Now, interestingly, Pseudo-Apuleius, right, a Latin language writer, in a text called De Orthographia, right, on or with respect to orthography, there it's mentioned that Orpheus, Linus, and Hesiod all together say that the gods in the beginning emanated out of chaos. So again, not all Orphic poems or poems ascribed to Linus seem to have actually literally begun with chaos, the void, in the way that Hesiod does. But I think this is a case of the same thing, right? The monistic fluidness of Orphic cosmology is such that it can incorporate all other cosmogonic traditions. When you espouse Orpheus's fluid, henotheistic, all-encompassing theology, you can then approach all other theogonic poems that are actually different and convey different things and just assimilate them all into this one monistic worldview because it's so flexible and so capable of consuming all things, just like how Zeus consumes everything and becomes pregnant with everything, right? Orphic cosmology can do exactly that. It can parasitically suck in all other cosmogonic traditions and birth them anew within itself as part of a monistic, cohesive, singular framework that reconciles all apparently conflicting traditions. So that's a lot to take in. That's very philosophic. But that's our starting point with Aristophanes, his mock Orphic cosmogony, as well as the Derveni Papyrus and the commentator. And now that we've looked at those texts in detail, and we've had a bit of a taste at the beginning of my talk of the various strains of Orphic poetry, we'll now move on to, in the next talk, looking at all the specific poems and how they differ and how they all come together. But I wanted to start with the Derveni Papyrus text because it is, of course, our oldest and most important document. All right, so that's all for today. I'll see you next time.